Section 1 of Tanar of Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tanar of Pellucidar. Prologue. Jason Gridley is a radio bug. Had he not been, this story never would have been written. Jason is 23 and scandalously good-looking, too good-looking to be a bug of any sort. As a matter of fact, he does not seem buggish at all, just a normal, sane young American who knows a great deal about many things in addition to radio, aeronautics, for example, and golf and tennis and polo. But this is not Jason's story. He is only an incident, an important incident in my life that made this story possible. And so, with a few more words of explanation, we shall leave Jason to his tubes and waves and amplifiers, concerning which he knows everything and I nothing. Jason is an orphan with an income, and after he graduated from Stanford, he came down and bought a couple of acres at Tarzan, and that is how and when I met him. While he was building, he made my office his headquarters, and was often in my study, and afterward I returned the compliment by visiting him in his new lab, as he calls it, a quite large room at the rear of his home, a quiet, restful room in a quiet, restful house of the Spanish-American farm type. Or we rode together in the Santa Monica Mountains in the cool air of early morning. Jason is experimenting with some new principle of radio, concerning which the less I say, the better it will be for my reputation, since I know nothing whatsoever about it and am likely never to. Perhaps I am too old, perhaps I am too dumb, perhaps I am just not interested. I prefer to ascribe my abysmal and persistent ignorance of all things pertaining to radio to the last state, that of disinterestedness. It salves my pride. I do know this, however, because Jason has told me that the idea he is playing with suggests an entirely new and unsuspected, well, let's call it wave. He says the idea was suggested to him by the vagaries of static, and in groping around in search of some device to eliminate this, he discovered in the ether an undercurrent that operated according to no previously known scientific laws. At his Tarzan home he has erected a station, and a few miles away, at the back of my ranch, another. Between these stations we talk to one another through some strange, ethereal medium that seems to pass through all other waves and all other stations, unsuspected and entirely harmless. So harmless is it that it has not the slightest effect upon Jason's regular set, standing in the same room and receiving over the same aerial. But this, which is not very interesting to anyone except Jason, is all by the way of getting to the beginning of the amazing narrative of the adventures of Tanar of Pellucidar. Jason and I were sitting in his lab one evening discussing, as we often did, innumerable subjects, from cabbages to kings, and coming back, as Jason usually did, to the Gridley wave, which is what we have named it. Much of the time Jason kept on his earphones, than which there is no greater discourager of conversation. But this does not irk me as much as most of the conversations one has to listen to through life. I like long silences and my own thoughts. Presently Jason removed the headpiece. "It is enough to drive a fellow to drink," he exclaimed. "What?" I asked. "I am getting that stuff again," he said. "I can hear voices, very faintly but unmistakably human voices. They are speaking a language unknown to man. It is maddening." "Mars, perhaps," I suggested, "or Venus?" He knitted his brows and then suddenly smiled one of his quick smiles. "Or Pellucidar." I shrugged. "Do you know, Admiral," he said, he calls me Admiral because of a yachting cap I wear at the beach, "that when I was a kid I used to believe every word of those crazy stories of yours about Mars and Pellucidar. The inner world of the Earth's core was as real to me as the High Sierras, the San Joaquin Valley, or the Golden Gate, and I felt that I knew the Twin Cities of Helium better than I did Los Angeles." I saw nothing improbable at all in that trip of David Innes and old man Perry through the earth's crust to Pellucidar. Yes, sir, that was all gospel to me when I was a kid. And now you are 23 and know that it can't be true, I said with a smile. You are trying to tell me it is true, are you? He demanded, laughing. I never told anyone that it is true, I replied. I let people think what they think, but I reserve the right to do likewise. Why, you know perfectly well that it would be impossible for that iron mole of Perry's to have penetrated 500 miles of the earth's crust. You know there is no inner world peopled by strange reptiles and men of the Stone Age. You know there is no Emperor of Pellucidar. Jason was becoming excited, but his sense of humor came to our rescue, and he laughed. I like to believe there is a Diane the Beautiful, I said. Yes, he agreed. But I am sorry you killed off Hooja the Sly One. He was a corking villain. There are always plenty of villains, I reminded him. They help the girl to keep their figures and their schoolgirl complexions, he said. How? I asked. The exercise they get from being pursued. You are making fun of me, I reproached him. But remember, please, that I am but a simple historian. If damsels flee and villains pursue, I must truthfully record the fact. Baloney, he exclaimed in the pure university English of America. Jason replaced his headpiece, and I returned to the perusal of the narrative of an ancient liar, who should have made a fortune out of the credulity of book readers, but seems not to have. Thus we sat for some time. Presently, Jason removed his earphones and turned toward me. I was getting music, he said, strange, weird music, and then suddenly there came loud shouts. And it seemed that I could hear blows struck, and there were screams and the sound of shots. Perry, you know, was experimenting with gunpowder down there below in Pellucidar, I reminded Jason with a grin, but he was inclined to be serious and did not respond in kind. You know, of course, he said, that there really has been a theory of an inner world for many years. Yes, I replied. I have read works expounding and defending such a theory. It supposes polar openings leading into the interior of the earth, said Jason. And it is substantiated by many seemingly irrefutable scientific facts, I reminded him. Open polar sea, warmer water farthest north, tropical vegetation floating southward from the polar regions, the northern lights, the magnetic pole, the persistent stories of the Eskimos that they are descended from a race that came from a warm country far to the north. I'd like to make a try for one of the polar openings, mused Jason as he replaced the earphones. Again there was a long silence, broken at last by a sharp exclamation from Jason. He pushed an extra headpiece toward me. Listen, he exclaimed. As I adjusted the earphones, I heard that which we had never before received on the Gridley wave, code. No wonder that Jason Gridley was excited, since there was no station on Earth other than his own attuned to the Gridley wave. Code. What could it mean? I was torn by conflicting emotions, to tear off the earphones and discuss this amazing thing with Jason, and to keep them on and listen. I am not what one might call an expert in the intricacies of code, but I had no difficulty in understanding the simple signal of 2 letters, repeated in groups of 3, with a pause after each group. D-I, 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 pause. D-I, 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 pause. I glanced up at Jason. His eyes, filled with puzzled questioning, met mine, as though to ask, "What does it mean?" The signal ceased, and Jason touched his own key, sending his initials, JG, 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 in the same grouping that we received the DI signal. Almost instantly he was interrupted. You could feel the excitement of the sender. DI, 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 Pellucidar rattled against our eardrums like machine gun fire. Jason and I sat in dumb amazement, staring at one another. "It is a hoax," I exclaimed, and Jason, reading my lips, shook his head. "How can it be a hoax?" he asked. There is no other station on Earth equipped to send or to receive over the Gridley wave, so there can be no means of perpetrating such a hoax." Our mysterious station was on the air again. "If you get this, repeat my signal," and he signed off with D-I-D-I-D-I. "That would be David Innes," mused Jason. "Emperor of Pellucidar," I added. Jason sent the message D-I-D-I-D-I, followed by "What station is this?" and "Who is sending?" "This is the Imperial Observatory at Greenwich, Pellucidar. Abner Perry sending. Who are you?" "This is the private experimental laboratory of Jason Gridley, Tarzana, California. Gridley sending," replied Jason. "I want to get into communication with Edgar Rice Burroughs. Do you know him?" "He is sitting here, listening in with me," replied Jason. "Thank God, if that is true. But how am I to know that it is true?" demanded Perry. I hastily scribbled a note to Jason. "Ask him if he recalls the fire in his first gunpowder factory, and that the building would have been destroyed had they not extinguished the fire by shoveling his gunpowder onto it." Jason grinned as he read the note and sent it. "It was unkind of David to tell of that," came back the reply, "but now I know that Burroughs is indeed there, as only he could have known of that incident. I have a long message for him. Are you ready?" "Yes," replied Jason. "Then stand by." And this is the message that Abner Perry sent from the bowels of the earth, from the Empire of Pellucidar. Introduction. It must be some 15 years since David Innes and I broke through the inner surface of the Earth's crust and emerged into savage Pellucidar. But when a stationary sun hangs eternally at high noon, and there was no restless moon, and there are no stars, time is measureless, and so it may have been 100 years ago, or 1. Who knows? Of course, since David returned to Earth and brought back many of the blessings of civilization, we have had the means to measure time, but the people did not like it. They found that it put restrictions and limitations upon them that they never had felt before, and they came to hate it and ignore it until David, in the goodness of his heart, issued an edict abolishing time in Pellucidar. It seemed a backward step to me, but I am resigned now, and perhaps happier, for when all is said and done, time is a hard master, as you of the outer world, who are slaves of the sun, would be forced to admit were you to give the matter thought. Here in Pellucidar we eat when we are hungry, we sleep when we are tired, we set out upon journeys when we leave, and we arrive at our destinations when we get there. Nor are we old because the earth has circled the sun 70 times since our birth, for we do not know that this has occurred. Perhaps I have been here 15 years, but what matter? When I came, I knew nothing of radio. My researches and studies were along other lines. But when David came back from the outer world, he brought many scientific works, and from these I learned all that I know of radio, which has been enough to permit me to erect 2 successful stations, one here at Greenwich and one at the capital of the Empire of Pellucidar. But try as I would, I never could get anything from the outer world, and after a while I gave up trying, convinced that the Earth's crust was impervious to radio. In fact, we used our stations but seldom, for after all, Pellucidar is only commencing to emerge from the Stone Age, and in the economy of the Stone Age there seems to be no crying need for radio. But sometimes I played with it, and upon several occasions I thought that I heard voices and other sounds that were not of Pellucidar. They were too faint to be more than vague suggestions of intriguing possibilities, but yet they did suggest something most alluring, and so I set myself to making changes and adjustments until this wonderful thing that has happened but now was made possible. And my delight in being able to talk with you is second only to my relief in being able to appeal to you for help. David is in trouble. He is a captive in the north, or what he and I call north, for there are no points of compass known to Pellucidarians. I have heard from him, however. He has sent me a message, and in it he suggests a startling theory that would make aid from the outer crust possible, if— But first, let me tell you the whole story. The story of the disaster that befell David Innes and what led up to it, and then you will be in a better position to judge as to the practicability of sending succor to David from the outer crust. The whole thing dates from our victories over the Mahars, the once dominant race of Pellucidar. When, with our well-organized armies, equipped with firearms and other weapons unknown to the Mahars, or their guerrilla-like mercenaries, the Sagoths, we defeated the reptilian monsters and drove their slimy hordes from the confines of the Empire, the human race of the inner world, for the first time in its history, took its rightful place among the orders of creation. But our victories laid the foundation for the disaster that has overwhelmed us. For a while there was no Mahar within the boundaries of any of the kingdoms that constitute the Empire of Pellucidar. But presently we had word of them here and there, small parties living upon the shores of sea or lake far from the haunts of man. They gave us no trouble. Their old power had crumbled beyond recall. Their Sagoths were now numbered among the regiments of the Empire. The Mahars had no longer the means to harm us. Yet we did not want them among us. They are eaters of human flesh, and we had no assurance that lone hunters would be safe from their voracious appetites. We wanted them to be gone, so David sent a force against them, but with orders to treat with them first, and attempt to persuade them to leave the Empire peacefully rather than embroil themselves in another war that might mean total extermination. Sagoths accompanied the expedition, for they alone of all the creatures of Pellucidar can converse in the sixth sense, fourth dimension language of the Mahars. The story that the expedition brought back was rather pitiful, and aroused David's sympathies, as stories of persecution and unhappiness always do. After the Mahars had been driven from the Empire, they had sought a haven where they might live in peace. They assured us that they had accepted the inevitable in a spirit of philosophy, and entertained no thoughts of renewing their warfare against the human race, or in any way attempting to win back their lost ascendancy. Far away upon the shores of a mighty ocean, where there were no signs of man, they settled in peace, but their peace was not for long. A great ship came, reminding the Mahars of the first ships they had seen, the ships that David and I had built, the first ships, as far as we knew, that ever had sailed the silent seas of Pellucidar. Naturally, it was a surprise to us to learn that there was a race within the inner world sufficiently far advanced to be able to build ships. But there was another surprise in store for us. The Mahars assured us that these people possessed firearms, and that because of their ships and their firearms they were fully as formidable as we, and they were much more ferocious, killing for the pure sport of slaughter. After the first ship had sailed away, the Mahars thought they might be allowed to live in peace, but this dream was short-lived, as presently the first ship returned, and with it were many others manned by thousands of bloodthirsty enemies, against whose weapons the great reptiles had little or no defense. Seeking only escape from man, the Mahars left their new home and moved back a short distance toward the Empire, but now their enemies seemed bent only upon persecution. They hunted them, and when they found them, the Mahars were again forced to fall back before the ferocity of their continued attacks. Eventually they took refuge within the boundaries of the Empire, and scarcely had David's expedition to them returned with its report when we had definite proof of the veracity of their tale, through messages from our northernmost frontier bearing stories of invasion by a strange, savage race of white men. Frantic was the message from Gurk, king of Thuria, whose far-flung frontier stretches beyond the land of awful shadow. Some of his hunters had been surprised, and all but a few killed or captured by the invaders. He had sent warriors then against them, but these too had met a like fate, being greatly outnumbered, and so he sent a runner to David begging the emperor to rush troops to his aid. Scarcely had the first runner arrived when another came, bearing tidings of the capture and sack of the principal town of the kingdom of Thuria. And then a third arrived from the commander of the invaders demanding that David come with tribute, or they would destroy his country and slay the prisoners they held as hostages. In reply, David dispatched Tanar, son of Gak, to demand the release of all prisoners and the departure of the invaders. Immediately runners were sent to the nearest kingdoms of the empire, and ere Tanar had reached the land of awful shadow, 10,000 warriors were marching along the same trail to enforce the demands of the emperor and drive the savage foe from Pellucidar. As David approached the land of awful shadow that lies beneath Pellucidar's mysterious satellite, a great column of smoke was observable in the horizonless distance ahead. It was not necessary to urge the tireless warriors to greater speed, for all who saw guessed that the invaders had taken another village and put it to the torch. And then came the refugees, women and children only, and behind them a thin line of warriors striving to hold back swarthy, bearded strangers, armed with strange weapons that resembled ancient harquebuses, with bell-shaped muzzles, huge unwieldy things that belched smoke and flame and stones and bits of metal. That the Pellucidarians, outnumbered 10 to 1, were able to hold back their savage foes at all was due to the more modern firearms that David and I had taught them to make and use. Perhaps half the warriors of Thuria were armed with these, and they were all that saved them from absolute rout, and perhaps total annihilation. Loud were the shouts of joy when the first of the refugees discovered and recognized the force that had come to their delivery. Gork and his people had been wavering in their allegiance to the Empire, as were several other distant kingdoms, but I believe that this practical demonstration of the value of the Federation ended their doubts forever, and left the people of the land of awful shadow and their king the most loyal subjects that David possessed. The effect upon the enemy of the appearance of 10,000 well-armed warriors was quickly apparent. They halted, and as we advanced they withdrew, but though they retreated, they gave us a good fight. David learned from Gork that Tanar had been retained as a hostage, but though he made several attempts to open negotiations with the enemy for the purpose of exchanging some prisoners that had fallen into our hands, for Tanar and other Pellucidarians he never was able to do so. Our forces drove the invaders far beyond the limits of the empire to the shores of a distant sea, where, with difficulty and the loss of many men, they at last succeeded in embarking their depleted forces on ships that were as archaic in design as were their ancient harquebuses. These ships rose to exaggerated heights at stern and bow, their sterns being built up in several stories or housed decks one atop another. There was much carving and seemingly intricate designs everywhere above the waterline, and each ship carried at her prow a figurehead painted like the balance of the ship in gaudy colors, usually a life-size or a heroic figure of a naked woman or a mermaid. The men themselves were equally bizarre and colorful, wearing gay cloths about their heads, wide sashes of bright colors, and huge boots with flapping tops, those that were not half naked and barefoot. Besides their harquebuses, they carried huge pistols and knives stuck in their belts, and at their hips were cutlasses. Altogether, with their bushy whiskers and fierce faces, they were at once a bad-looking and a picturesque lot. From some of the last prisoners he took during the fighting at the seashore, David learned that Tanar was still alive, and that the chief of the invaders had determined to take him home with him in the hope that he could learn from Tanar the secrets of our superior weapons and gunpowder, for notwithstanding my first failures, I had, and not without some pride, finally achieved a gunpowder that would not only burn, but that would ignite with such force as to be quite satisfactory. I am now perfecting a noiseless, smokeless powder, though honesty compels me to confess that my first experiments have not been entirely what I had hoped they might be. The first batch detonated, having nearly broken my eardrums, and so filled my eyes with smoke that I thought I had been blinded. When David saw the enemy ship sailing away with Tanar, he was sick with grief, for Tanar always had been an especial favorite of the Emperor and his gracious Empress, Diane the Beautiful. He was like a son to them. We had no ships upon this sea, and David could not follow with his army. Neither, being David, could he abandon the son of his best friend to a savage enemy before he had exhausted every resource at his command in an effort toward rescue. In addition to the prisoners that had fallen into his hands, David had captured one of the small boats that the enemy had used in embarking his forces, and this it was that suggested to David the mad scheme upon which he embarked. The boat was about 16 feet long, and was equipped with both oars and a sail. It was broad of beam, and had every appearance of being staunch and seaworthy, though pitifully small in which to face the dangers of an unknown sea, peopled, as are all the waters of Pellucidar, with huge monsters possessing short tempers and long appetites. Standing upon the shore, gazing after the diminishing outlines of the departing ships, David reached his decision. Surrounding him were the captains and the kings of the federated kingdoms of Pellucidar, and behind these 10,000 warriors leaning upon their arms. To one side the sullen prisoners, heavily guarded, gazed after their departing comrades, with what sensations of hopelessness and envy one may guess. David turned toward his people. "Those departing ships have borne away Tanar, the son of Gak, and perhaps a score more of the young men of Pellucidar. It is beyond reason to expect that the enemy ever will bring our comrades back to us, but it is easy to imagine the treatment they will receive at the hands of this savage, bloodthirsty race. We may not abandon them while a single avenue of pursuit remains open to us. Here is that avenue." He waved his hand across the broad ocean. "And here the means of traversing it." He pointed to the small boat. "It would carry scarce 20 men," cried one who stood near the emperor. "It need carry but 3, replied David, "for it will sail to rescue, not by force, but by strategy, or perhaps only to locate the stronghold of the enemy, that we may return and lead a sufficient force upon it to overwhelm it." "I shall go," concluded the emperor. "Who will accompany me?" Instantly every man within hearing of his voice, saving the prisoners only, flashed a weapon above his head and pressed forward to offer his services. David smiled. "I knew as much," he said, "but I cannot take you all. I shall need only one, and that shall be Jah of Anauroch, the greatest sailor of Pellucidar." A great shout arose, for Jah, the king of Anauroch, who is also the chief officer of the navy of Pellucidar, is vastly popular throughout the empire, and though all were disappointed in not being chosen, yet they appreciated the wisdom of David's selection. "But 2 is too small a number to hope for success," argued Gak, "and I, the father of Tanar, shall be permitted to accompany you." "Numbers, such as we might crowd in that little boat, would avail us nothing," replied David. "So why risk a single additional life? If 20 could pass through the unknown dangers that lie ahead of us, 2 may do the same, while with fewer men we can carry a far greater supply of food and water against the unguessed extent of the great sea that we face, and the periods of calm and the long search." "But 2 are too few to man the boat," expostulated another. "And Gak is right. The father of Tanar should be among his rescuers." "Gak is needed by the Empire," replied David. "He must remain to command the armies for the Empress until I return. But there shall be a third who will embark with us." "Who?" demanded Gak. "One of the prisoners," replied David. "For his freedom we should readily find one willing to guide us to the country of the enemy." Nor was this difficult, since every prisoner volunteered when the proposal was submitted to them. David chose a young fellow who said his name was Fit, and who seemed to possess a more open and honest countenance than any of his companions. And then came the provisioning of the boat. Bladders were filled with fresh water, and quantities of corn and dried fish and jerked meat, as well as vegetables and fruits, were packed into other bladders, and all were stored in the boat until it seemed that she might carry no more. For 3 men the supplies might have been adequate for a year's voyage upon the outer crust, where time enters into all calculations. The prisoner Fit, who was to accompany David and Jah, assured David that 1/4 the quantity of supplies would be ample, and that there were points along the route they might take where their water supply could be replenished, and where game abounded, as well as native fruits, nuts, and vegetables. But David would not cut down by a single ounce the supplies that he had decided upon. As the three were about to embark, David had a last word with Ghak. "You have seen the size and the armament of the enemy ships, Ghak," he said. "My last injunction to you is to build at once a fleet that can cope successfully with these great ships of the enemy, and while the fleet is building, and it must be built upon the shores of this sea, send expeditions forth to search for a waterway from this ocean to our own. Can you find it, all of our ships can be utilized, and the building of the greater navy accelerated by utilizing the shipyards of Anarok. When you have completed and manned 50 ships, set forth to our rescue if we have not returned by then. Do not destroy these prisoners, but preserve them well, for they alone can guide you to their country." And then David I, Emperor of Pellucidar, and Jah, King of Anarok, and the prisoner Fit boarded the tiny boat. Friendly hands pushed them out upon the long, oily swells of a Pellucidarian sea. 10,000 throats cheered them upon their way, and 10,000 pairs of eyes watched them, until they had melted into the mist of the upcurving, horizonless distance of a Pellucidarian seascape. David had departed upon a vain but glorious adventure, and in the distant capital of the empire, Diane the Beautiful would be weeping. End of Section 1.